Well, it is a crime that rocked a Chicago suburb. The Brown's Chicken Massacre in Palatine has gone down as one of the most notorious murders in Chicago history. And now a new book is giving readers fresh insight into what happened. On January 8th, 1993, 2 owners and 5 employees of that Brown's Chicken in Palatine were shot and killed during a robbery and found in a walk-in cooler. Police searched for the killers for nearly a decade until a big break in 2002 when information from one of the suspect's ex-girlfriend and DNA from a partially eaten piece of chicken helped lead to 2 arrests. Those 2 men convicted, now serving life sentences, and the restaurant was torn down in 2001. Patrick Wall has written that book. It's called Something Big, the true story of the Brown's Chicken Massacre. I spoke with him about what readers can learn. So, Patrick, why did you decide to write this book, and how is it different, perhaps, than past recountings of this very infamous case?
Well, 30 years have passed since this case, and there's been a lot written. There's been podcasts that are pumped out about this case almost every month. But I've noticed in a lot of the past tellings of this case, it's often done by people who have no connection to Chicago. They pronounce the names of things wrong, they get facts wrong, and of course, they leave out the stories of those people involved. And so that's what I tried to focus on in this book, was telling the story in a different way, focused on the more human element of this.
How did you do that?
Well, each chapter in the book is based on a different individual associated with the case. So I interviewed more than 40 people for the story. I tried to give people a sense of what it was like to come at this from all different angles. So I didn't just speak to 40 police or 40 family members or 40 people associated with it in one area. I tried to give them a different perspective of each. So, for example, I spoke to Martin Blake. He was one of the first suspects in the early hours after the case, and his name was completely drawn through the ringer. His video of him was put on all the newscasts. His picture was on the front page of all the newspapers, and he talked to me about what it was like to be branded as the first suspect. Even though he had nothing to do with it in the end, his name was cleared. He had to leave the state because it completely ruined his life.
Yet you did not interview the 2 men ultimately convicted of the crimes, Juan Luna and James Degorski. Why not? Well,
it's a question I thought long and hard about, whether to interview them. And my focus of the book was ultimately telling the stories of, in particular, the victims and the other people who helped solve this case. And so there's been, both men maintain their innocence to this day. One of them has a blog where he says all sorts of things about this case that have no factual basis. And I think true crime today tends to focus too much on the killers. You know, when there's a tragedy or a school shooting or something, we often see the picture of the person put on the news, when I think sometimes when that happens, that's exactly what the person wanted. So you'll notice in this book that their picture isn't even in the book. There's sketches of them during the court trials, and I, of course, tell their stories based on information that other people did not have access to in previous tellings, such as interviews with people who knew them, as well as transcripts from the trials in 2007 and 2009. So I felt that I could be fair to everyone and tell their stories accurately and weave those in without necessarily giving credence to their belief that they're innocent, which they're not.
Now, for those who might not remember, it took 9 years before any arrests were made, and it came down to a chicken bone, if I remember correctly, with DNA on it that finally cracked the case, and the former girlfriend, right, of Juan Luna is going to police and saying, hey, here's what I know. During that 9 years, though, Palatine police detectives were vilified for botching the case. I remember hearing reports of too many fingerprints and handprints at the scene, of footprints that shouldn't have been there. But you say no, they didn't botch the case.
Absolutely. I think there's been this myth in Chicagoland for a long time that the Palatine police botched the case. But I think with the clarity of hindsight and 30 years having passed, that's just not true. They were not parochial or protective of the investigation. They brought in all of the right people, from the FBI and all the 3-letter federal agencies to some of Chicago's most experienced detectives. And ultimately, whenever the case was brought in a direction or a dead end, it was usually the outsiders in that case, not the Palatine police, who put it in that direction. And I think ultimately no police force was going to solve this in 1993 based on the technology and the evidence that they had. The only way it was going to be solved was in the way that it was, and that's someone coming forward.
Well, I told you I took a particular interest in this case, not just because I was a young reporter in Peoria at that time, but I grew up in Palatine as well. And so I was familiar with the culture in Palatine, and a lot of people back then said, hey, nothing like this had ever happened in Palatine, and the police department was just not equipped to conduct that sort of investigation. But you say, no, they did the best they could at that time, and in fact, I would imagine you think it was pretty smart of them to make sure they saved the chicken bone that was found in the garbage.
Yes, definitely, and that was ultimately what was able to connect Juan Luna, one of the killers, to the crime scene. I think, too, the lesson that people learn from this in the suburbs in particular is how to use a task force to investigate crimes in the suburbs or smaller cities where they might not have the resources. And so there's this notion that they were acting like they had the resources, knew exactly what they're doing, but that isn't what they were doing. They were bringing in all the outside help that they could get, and that became a model for how other suburbs investigate crimes of this nature. So I think that's an important lesson from this too.
Okay, Patrick, thank you.
Thanks for having me.
And Patrick Wall will be at a book talk and signing this Saturday at Barbara's Bookstore, located within the Yorktown Shopping Center in Lombard. That's at 3 p.m. and you can register at patrickwall.com.